One of the things I've been talking about during the last year of Donald Trump's presidency and during the campaign and during the transition period and during Joe Biden's nascent presidency is that the Republican Party at this point has stopped even pretending to be about policy and values and is merely about performative outrage, misplaced outrage, laughable outrage. We're going to look at an example in a moment, but I think this is an important sort of reset to do. And I know many of you might be thinking, David, the Republican Party hasn't really been about policy for a very long time. That's true, but they used to pretend to be about policy. For a time, the Republican Party really was about tax cuts for the rich, cutting budgets by cutting social programs, spreading the quote, spreading democracy through invasive foreign policy around the world. They tried passing bills to get these things done. Eventually, during the end of the Bush era and into the Barack Obama presidency, both terms, the Republican Party started to become about policy in name only, but not sincerely. They went from really trying to do policy to just talking about it, but not really caring about policy. They'd claim to be about cutting the deficit and reducing the debt and fiscal responsibility, but not when George W. Bush wanted to explode the deficit by going to war with the wrong country. And they refused to acknowledge when Barack Obama did cut the deficit. So they went from being about a few policies, bad policies, policies I disagreed with, to only claiming to be about those policies while not actually doing a thing about it. And we saw more and more that the Republican Party became obsessed with grievances, the so-called war on Christmas they were fighting non-existent censorship, fighting non-existent oppression by gay people, at what they called the gay lobby rather than of LGBTQ folks, that type of thing. And then Trump ran on policy, terrible policy, but he ran on it and then just didn't do it when he became president of the United States. He ran on building a wall. He didn't build it. He ran on replacing Obamacare with a beautiful new health care plan. Plan never existed. I think we're still 2 weeks away from Trump unveiling it, even though he's out of office. He ran on paying off the debt in one term. He did the opposite. And over the presidency of Donald Trump, the Republican Party went from being about these bad policy ideas to being about the news is fake. You can only trust us. Everybody else is lying to you. Democrats are censoring you and us. Social media is censoring you and us. They're being unfair to Trump. They're canceling Thanksgiving. They're canceling Christmas. They're canceling the Constitution. They're canceling, COVID guidelines violate the Constitution. And so what we have left today is a Trumpian Republican Party that is about nothing other than performative outrage. What policy is Marjorie Taylor Greene about? Nothing. She barely even pretends to be about policy because she knows nothing about policy, and it's essentially a grievance campaign. What policy is Madison Cawthorn about? Nothing. And in fact, we've gotten reports from inside his staff that he is running a communications platform rather than a policy platform. We know, we could tell. It's all about being outraged at the left for things that don't even exist. And right-wing media has jumped on the train, probably because it's profitable for them. I'm going to play a clip now that is the epitome of this. Fox News invited a Minnesota Republican state senator named Julia Coleman on. Why did they do that? Because she's furious. And Fox News is outraged that Minnesota educational standards don't rail against socialism enough. And that's the reason that she's outraged. Take a look.
Standards have a stated purpose more like that of the 1619 Project than that of maintaining freedom.
Well, it's all part of an evolution that went from the civics department to social studies. We actually reached out to the Minnesota Department of Education for a statement. Here's a portion of what they said. They said the benchmarks listed in this first draft are simply examples of what could be included under each standard. Historical U.S. events like World War II and the Holocaust are being taught in Minnesota schools. We welcome Senator Coleman's feedback as well as the feedback of every American. So based on what you've revealed, do you feel like they're fairly including portions of, say, World War II? And would they exclude them if no one spoke up about it? If you didn't expose this, what would they get away with?
Well, quite frankly, Pete, this is not exactly true what they're saying, because 5,000 parents in Minnesota reached out to the review board stating their concerns, and they were brushed off in a recent meeting.
Now, if you're having trouble understanding what she's so mad about, and what Fox host Pete Hegseth is so mad about, it's because it's all a performative farce. This is what the Republican Party in the immediate post-Trump era is about. Nothing. Outrage porn based on nothing. Now, the question becomes, and it's an important question for the Republican Party to answer, how long can the Republican Party survive on the platform of baseless outrage? For a while, it will work because you're getting people outraged. But if they continue to be about imaginary censorship while voting against a COVID relief bill that Joe Biden and Democrats get done, and it gets money to people and voters know it, what does this outrage performative nonsense do for them in the 2022 midterms? I don't know the answer, and it remains to be seen, but it could be very, very bad. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later in the context of this third party that Donald Trump is looking at, and which 64% of Republicans, if you can believe it, would be open to joining and abandoning the Republican Party. We'll talk about that later. You can find me on Twitter at @Pakman.